On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program independent journalist Beth Schwartzapfel on her piece in the American Prospect, which won a 2014 Sydney Award for social justice journalism. Welcome to the program, Beth.
Thanks for having me.
So, Beth, let's dig into this, because this is a topic that. As you write in the Great American Chain Gang, this is a topic that I think there's a lot of fear of addressing by at least political leaders and apparently even unions, because we are still living, I think, in the shadow of the hysteria that took place. You know, I think in the 70s and the 80s about crime, and maybe you could even say, it's been used. Obviously it was used against Michael Dukakis, but it is how we treat our prisoners and the efficacy in which our penal system, I guess, presents in terms of actual rehabilitation. And so let's start with you profile a couple of people in this. You start off with Lori Hazen. Tell us about her story.
Lori's story is like a lot of inmates in general, but particularly a lot of female inmates' stories, which is that she had a minor child at home who she was the primary support person for. She had nonviolent drug-related felonies, and especially with drug-related crimes, you see a lot of this revolving door, in and out of prison for various sort of low-level nonviolent crimes. And each time she went to prison, she lost whatever job she had on the outside. She lost her apartment, and because she was sort of living because of her addiction, and she was sort of living on the edge anyway, it would wipe her out financially. And so she'd go in with nothing. Many inmates get by because they have families who can send them money, put money into their commissary so they can buy things like deodorant, like toothpaste, like snacks to supplement the very meager meals. But she didn't have anyone on the outside to send her money, so she relied on this prison job to buy even stamps to write her kid, sanitary napkins, things like that.
I don't think people realize that barely anything is provided for prisoners. I mean, one would imagine sanitary napkins would be provided, but no, right?
One would imagine. I mean, it varies from state to state, and usually they do provide some sort of bare minimum level of that stuff. So, like, maybe you'll get a certain ration of them. Maybe you'll get 10 a month or something. I know in Massachusetts, where Lori was, they got a trial-size tube of toothpaste per period of time. I think it was per month. And there was a prohibition on borrowing and lending. So not only did they not give you enough toothpaste to last the whole month, but you could get in trouble if somebody lent you their toothpaste. So you rely on whatever money you can either earn in prison or that your family can put in your commissary for you to supplement that kind of stuff.
And so when she had her job, tell us what her job was and what she got paid for it.
She worked as a dishwasher, and because she was in for less than a year, see, a lot of the higher-paying jobs are ones that require a period of training, and so they exclude people whose prison sentences are short. And I should add that because most women are incarcerated on nonviolent drug-related crimes, most of their sentences are short. So I didn't actually look at this more broadly, but I would suspect that the number of meager as it is, the number of rehabilitative, like real work programs available to inmates are probably disproportionately available to men because their sentences tend to be longer. But not to digress. So she was offered 2 different jobs she could choose between. One was cleaning bathrooms and one was working the kitchen. And she chose the kitchen job because she was just constantly hungry. The portions were so small, and she thought, at least if I work in the kitchen, I can get a little something extra to eat. And she was paid, I honestly can't remember exactly what. It was something in the neighborhood of 15 cents an hour to sterilize the dishes after meals. So three meals a day, she would work in this in this giant dishwashing machine where they would load the plates in, and the steam would be pouring out, and she would send them back out to use at the next meal.
And you report the median wage in state and federal prisons is 20 and 31 cents an hour, respectively. Half of the 1.6 million Americans serving time in prison have full-time jobs. And then we start to look into, that these are jobs unlike any other jobs, not just in terms of the type of work, but in terms of the type of protections and value you get from them. There's no Social Security taxes. There's no sick time or overtime. And you note that in 3 states they work for free. How is this a recent phenomena? Sort of contextualize this for us in terms of the history of prisoners doing labor essentially for free.
Sure. No, this goes back to basically the Jim Crow era. A lot of people I spoke to likened this to the convict leasing system that was, during Reconstruction, a lot of the southern states, in order to get around the prohibition on slavery, came up with all of these sort of invented felonies. Like, I think one of them was like picking cotton after dark, loitering, things like that, where they could basically easily arrest large numbers of black men. And then once they were incarcerated, they were leased out to mining companies, to plantation owners, where they were forced to work for free. And so it was basically a way to recreate the plantation system of slave labor in a way that was legal under Reconstruction. Now, I do want to stress that is a pretty extreme parallel to draw, and I don't think working conditions in most prison workplaces are nearly that extreme anymore. However, I do think it's fair to draw that line, especially since, as one of my sources pointed out, many of the crimes that people are incarcerated for now were not crimes 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so we see sort of the reasons that we choose to lock people up evolving, just as we did during Reconstruction.
Interesting. And let's talk about the lack of, how, these are jobs, but they're not jobs in the sense that we understand them when we work outside of prison, because we have, not only do we get Social Security, or we have, we have a whole series of protections for mostly, as far as I can tell, these are largely unregulated.
Yeah, that's entirely true. In fact, the courts have found again and again that they are not subject to regulation as employment. And they sort of, as one of my sources said, the judges sort of logic themselves into pretzels trying to explain why it is that what these guys are doing in prison is not employment, even though for all intents and purposes it appears to be employment. But judges have found again and again that they're not employees, and so they're not subject to minimum wage. They're not subject to, overtime restrictions. Any of the things, the sort of advances that we've made in workplace protections over the last generation just do not apply to prisoners because the courts have found that they're not employees. In fact, the only exception, which I thought was really interesting, is that OSHA does hold that inmates doing work that is substantially similar to work that people do on the outside are protected by OSHA. Now, of course, OSHA only has jurisdiction over federal prisons and a limited number of state prisons, but still, I do think that's interesting. But the reason for this actually is enshrined in the Constitution. The 13th Amendment prohibits slavery except as punishment for a crime. And that goes back to chain gangs. That's the origin of the term. So our very Constitution says that prisoners can be used as slave labor. And just to get back to just the OSHA thing, that we should also note that there's no they really have no enforcement mechanism, or at least an effective one, right? And I think at one point the GAO, you write, took OSHA to task. Absolutely. Yeah, OSHA. So the problem is that one of OSHA's most powerful tools is surprise inspections. But given the way that prisons are structured, you can't really surprise a prison. That just doesn't work that way. They're not going to let people in without notice and planning. so that structure was what led to a really terrible, very dangerous, toxic workplace environment at a number of federal prisons across the country. Their Correctional Industries program, also known as UNICOR, was running an e-waste recycling program where inmates were recycling things like computer screens and televisions. Now, this is theoretically a great industry, right? I mean, this is our future, right? This is a great source of potentially manufacturing jobs in the U.S. in the future, and to train people to work with electronics sounds great, right? Except that it requires a very specialized level of knowledge and skill to be able to do it safely. And what these UNICOR shops were doing was basically giving inmates hammers and saying, go ahead and smash this television. And, that releases just crazy amounts of toxic dust. And these inmates were told, oh, no, it's totally safe, or they were given these sort of flimsy hospital masks. They weren't given clean clothes to change into when they went to go eat, and as a result, actually, a number of cafeteria workers, and some of them civilians, not inmates, got sick from this dust, from just being around this dust and eating food that was covered in this dust. And in the end, thousands of both correctional officers, family members of correctional officers, and inmates were sickened by this toxic dust because every time OSHA would come to inspect, suddenly UNICOR, they would have this advance notice and they could kind of clean up their act for the day or for the week. And so that sort of exposes the weakness in the tools that OSHA has to use. The other thing is that OSHA can't levy fines on the federal government. So their ability to enforce even violations they do find is very, very limited.
All right, so let's talk about before we get into sort of the perspective of why we want people to have jobs in prison in terms of things like recidivism. Why, if these conditions are so harsh and the payments are so small, and maybe this seems obvious to people, I don't know, but the prisoners that you interviewed and the former prisoners, why did they want to have jobs?
Well, I should also reiterate that not all of the working conditions are like that. A lot of them are not terribly pleasant jobs. A lot of them are sort of factory-style jobs or working in a dish room, as Larry Hazen did. But all of us like to have a sense of purpose and a routine every day, and especially in a place like prison that can be just deadening and, frankly, deathly boring. You wake up in the morning and, you have stretches of years ahead of you. It provides them a sense of purpose and a sense of structure to their days, to have some place to go and a job to do. And that's leaving aside the question of payment. I mean, even these meager payments are something. They're better than nothing. And the money in your commissary account can be the difference between being able to make phone calls to your family and not.
And we should also say the implications of incarceration on families in general has broad economic impact, right? I mean, in some respects, not only are we paying to essentially incarcerate people, but then we're paying for their families, because I think you write there's a huge percentage of the people that we incarcerate are essentially the breadwinners for the families who then need public assistance.
Yeah, exactly. There's much higher rates of use of public assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, programs like that among families of people who are incarcerated. Right, which makes sense, right? I mean, it makes perfect sense if you think about it.
Right. And I think you write that families with an incarcerated parent are 50% more likely to use Medicaid, twice as likely to use food stamps. What I didn't realize, too, is that when people get out of prison, they've basically got to pay. They've got to pay for. There's a whole host of fees that are associated that they have obviously no money to pay for because they've been in prison and have been making virtually nothing. Yeah,
fees and fines are a huge issue, and there are counties where hundreds of people are locked up routinely in a given year because they can't pay their fees and fines. It's this, people call it debtors prison. It's this crazy. I mean, the cost of putting somebody in jail it's so absurd if you think about the logic. What that person owes, say that person owes $1,000 in fees and fines, which, if you're broke, is an insurmountable amount of money. But for a city or a county is basically pennies. So you take this person who owes $1,000 and you say, well, you can't pay that $1,000, I'm going to put you in jail. And the cost to put them in jail so far exceeds that $1,000 that it just defies logic that is the choice that these counties are making, and yet this happens routinely across the country.
Yeah, I mean, you cite the Brennan Center's report that says in one Ohio county, more than 20% of all jail bookings stem from a failure to pay fines.
Isn't that stunning?
It's amazing. But why hasn't this occurred to anybody? That
I think there's been some coverage of it, and there's been, the Brennan Center report, the Human Rights Watch has done a couple of reports about this, but, it's the same reason that nobody thinks about why people in prison deserve labor protections. It's because, over the course of the last generation, as you pointed out, inmates, people who have committed crimes have moved farther and farther to the margins of our sort of national consciousness. And even as certain communities, going to prison has become a kind of sad and twisted rite of passage. There's some communities where 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 people are going to go to prison in their lifetime. The national political conversation and, the other communities act as if these people are pariahs, as if they don't deserve to ever return safely to society. They don't deserve any protections. Once you commit a crime, the way that our country sort of approaches that is basically you've given up any right that you have to return to a semblance of normalcy. So even once you serve your time, many states restrict people with felony convictions from voting. Many people with felony convictions are prevented from living in public housing, prevented from getting assistance with their financial aid for school. The only plausible explanation for any of this is just that there's something of it becomes a mark, it becomes a scarlet letter that going to prison is no longer enough, that now we need to sort of punish you for the rest of your life for whatever you did.
But this, I mean, what amazes me, like that part I can I can comprehend that. You know what I mean? Like that, I see what goes around. I see how it makes people feel icky, and I can see how it's like, well, I'm not going to be the politician to go out on a limb, to defend a criminal. But it just occurs to me, like, isn't there some county supervisor somewhere who says, we could save X number % of our budget if we just said, those fines, we're going to waive them, because for every dollar that we waive on a fine, we can save $20,000 or something like that.
Exactly.
I mean, in the course of your reporting, did you come across because this is where I would imagine we would see that type of reform coming from, would be just the number crunchers on a state or a county level, just saying, you know what, this is stupid.
Yeah, you would think. I mean, there is some movement on the right. There's an national organization called Right on Crime, that's trying to take conservative principles, which are, say, fiscal responsibility, and apply them to the criminal justice system. Because for years there's been this sort of tension inherent in the conservative position, which is on the one hand, lock them up and throw away the key, and on the other hand, keep a tight fist on your fiscal purse. And the two are just not compatible. And I think slowly now more voices are recognizing that. I mean, people on the left, it's predictable that those of us on the left are going to be the ones saying, this system doesn't make any sense. So it's easy to dismiss people on the left who argue that. But when the right starts to recognize that, the financial choices that are being made in the name of being tough on crime just don't make any sense, especially since, being tough on crime, like incarcerating 2.2 million people, 1 in 100 Americans, is actually not getting us any results. So we're wasting the money. We're just doing it for the purpose of political rhetoric.
I have to say, and I don't find myself saying this often or if ever, but I do think that there's actually, I think crime on the right in certain areas, in certain pockets on the right, is one of the few places where I'm seeing actually some sort of genuine intellectual policy making. And I honestly, I mean, I can't think of any other area, but I think that's actually genuinely the one place where we're seeing some genuine sort of sincere thought, based on sort of the efficacy of this. And let's talk to that, because you also profile a guy named Glenn Martin. And this seems to be like sort of the perfect example. He seems to sum up that dynamic quite well. Just tell us about him.
Glenn's an amazing guy. I encourage anybody who's interested in the subject to look up his organization, Just Leadership USA. So Glenn grew up in New York, with a single mom in very trying financial circumstances. Nobody in his community went to college. Basically the thing he did graduate from high school, I think. But what you did when you got older is you basically robbed stores, you hustled, you did what you could to get by. And his girlfriend was pregnant, and he was trying to make some money for this baby, so he started robbing stores. And he got caught robbing a jewelry store and got sent away for 6 years. Now, Glenn is one of the smartest people I have ever met. I mean, he's somebody who you get into a conversation with him and you think like, whoa, my brain operates at like 1/10 at what your brain operates. And what he says is that when he got to prison, he discovered basically everyone around him had this amazing sense of ingenuity, of wits, of smarts, and that for so many of them, it was sort of misplaced or misguided, like his was, into crime. Where if you could sort of harness that for good, especially for sort of changing the way we think about the criminal justice system, then that could be such a powerful force. So again, sorry to digress, but that's what his organization is committed to. Justice Leadership USA is to sort of harness the smarts and the cleverness and ingenuity of formerly incarcerated people to sort of change the way we think and talk about the criminal justice system. But that was like fast forward like 20 years. So while Glenn's in prison, he knows that he has an outstanding child support order, but while he was out, it was something very manageable. It was like $25 a week or $50 a week, and he sort of naively thought, well, if I'm in prison 6 years and that adds up, that'll add up to like a couple $1,000s, but I think I'll still be able to pay it down when I get out. What he didn't know is that because he wasn't showing up to his court dates, the judge issued a default order which automatically triggered the payments to like triple, so that by the time he got out, he owed like tens of thousands of dollars in child support arrears. And what's interesting is that he had a good relationship with his ex, and she didn't even really want the money. But because she had applied for public assistance when he went in, he now owed the money to the state. Because when the state provides public assistance to her,
it's recoupable from the father.
Exactly. So he went through this epic saga. He wanted so badly to do right and to turn his life around. He got this job working as like a paralegal at a law firm. He was making like $15,000 a year and living with his mom and really trying to make that work. And yet these payments were just crushing him. And nobody, and this gets back to what we were talking about before, nobody was willing to try to help him. Nobody was willing to see it from his point of view. All the judges he went to talk to were basically treated him like deadbeat trash, like, why haven't you been supporting your kid? Everybody he talked to from the child support agencies basically treated him the same way, like, why aren't you stepping up and taking responsibility for your kid? And he kept saying, I'm trying. This is just impossible to do on $15,000 a year. So finally he just got fed up, and he started going down to Canal Street in New York and buying counterfeit handbags and selling them on eBay. He just said it was very important to him to start from zero, to basically start his new life with no debt, and to just see what he could do for himself without any of the sort of financial hindrance of this. So it took him about a year doing this like online scam to pay down his debt, and then he hasn't committed another crime since, and he's in fact gone on to have an amazingly successful career.
It's fascinating because you quote him as saying, I think the statute of limitations are over, so I think I can say it out loud. I broke the law, when he talks about like to dig himself out of this. And what I think is the most poignant is he says the system creates this weird situation where it tells you to do the right thing and turn your life around, and then actually incentivizes future violations of the law, even if you're inspired to do the right thing. And this is what the argument is to paying. To providing a better sort of work for prisoners, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, that's what it comes down to.
Absolutely. Not just providing better work, but even if you began with the work that prisoners are already doing. I mean, 870,000 inmates are already working, and they're doing jobs that somebody has to do, right? I mean, if Lori Hazen weren't washing dishes in the prison, somebody would have to wash dishes, and the median wage for a dishwasher is something like $9 an hour. So it's a lie to pretend that these jobs are sort of charity or that the prison is providing them as like a a way to not keep inmates idle. All those things are true, but truthfully, they're saving a lot of money by paying prisoners so little. So what if we started with the jobs they're already doing, which have to get done, and just paid them minimum wage? I mean, forget prevailing wage, just paid minimum wage. I mean, the prison system certainly can't afford it, but, frankly, we can't afford the current system either. And if Glenn Martin had been paid minimum wage during his 6 years in prison, he might have been able to keep up with his child care payments, and none of that might have happened. And it boggles the mind to think of what a difference that one change could really change everything in the way that we incarcerate people in this country.
Well, so how do you address that claim that prisons would all go bankrupt? And this is also, I don't want to throw two questions at you at once, but I'm going to. Okay. It also occurs to me that you looked at this. It was sort of your piece was agnostic relative to the distinction between privately run and publicly run prisons. And I wonder if what that plays into this dynamic. And so what about that notion of affordability for prisons? Would it just be a question of providing more funds for prisons? How does that work?
Well, I'll tackle your questions one at a time. So the first question, as far as affordability, I actually, frankly, don't disbelieve them at all that the prisons would go bankrupt if they had to do this. But I guess my thought is, the businesses that argue that they would go bankrupt if we implemented a minimum wage, some of them probably did. But in the end, the system sort of stabilized itself, and we recognize that a minimum wage is a common good, and it's worth it, whatever sort of financial ripple effects that law has. And we have this argument every time we raise the minimum wage. We just saw it happen in the Pacific Northwest when they implemented a very high minimum living wage. I think it was in Seattle. So I think you would see something similar here where, at first what would happen is the prisons would scramble to figure out where that money would come from, and it might be ugly for a while. But at the end of the day, I think what would happen is judges would think twice or three times or five times before sentencing someone to prison if they knew that the prison couldn't afford to keep them. Maybe people like Lori Hazen, who were not a violent criminal, who didn't really pose any threat to society and who frankly just really needed drug treatment, would get drug treatment instead of being sent to prison. And so the ones who are sent there are the ones who really need to be there. And the numbers, I think, would be much, much, much smaller, and it would be much more affordable to pay them what they deserve for the work that they're doing.
And based upon all the research, obviously that this dynamic that we saw with Martin is that if people leave prison with at least some stake, so that they're not starting out in an impossible hole, and they have a different relationship to work, and they are starting to train. Theoretically, recidivism rates, and maybe not even theoretically, you tell me, the data seems to show that in those circumstances, people return to prison a lot less.
Oh, yeah. There's been tons of studies on this, that people who have sort of meaningful work while they're incarcerated, especially those who have sort of apprentice-style work or job training alongside whatever work they're doing, are much, much less likely to return to prison. And it makes sense, right? It makes perfect sense. If you get out and you have the skills and the experience you need to get a good job, then, like Glenn, you're much less incentivized to break the law. Some people break the law because they're bad people, but most people break the law because they're desperate or they don't see any other options. And what having job training and job experience does is it gives you options.
All right, so address that part about private prisons. How does that play into this, or is that sort of a secondary issue?
Well, I would say if you're talking sort of theoretically about whether inmates deserve to be paid for their work, I think that's true no matter what prison they're held in. When you're talking about what the sort of ethical implications are of paying people so little for their work, it does become a little bit of a different conversation when you're talking about private prisons. You're right that I didn't have space to get into this in the piece, but in fact, there was a UN commission on slavery that sort of issues guidelines on what's considered slavery and what's not, and they specifically pointed at inmates who are required to work and either not paid or underpaid in private prisons as as slavery, because in that case, underpaying them or forcing them to work directly impacts the bottom line of this private company.
Right.
And so you're basically exploiting people for profit. And, there are people who would, and you could make an argument that it's not so different in a public prison. But I think it is clear that when you're talking about a specific corporation's gain, the Corrections Corporation of America and Wackenhut are both publicly held companies. So basically by forcing people to work against their will and paying them so little for their work, what you're basically doing is using them as slaves to line shareholders' pockets.
Every $7 some odd worth of workers, productive hour is essentially just, dividends to shareholders.
And in the case of private prisons, these are people held there against their will. I mean, even if they sign up to work, it's not like that is a job that they would choose if they weren't being held in the prison. So the ethical issues are there no matter what, but they're especially thorny when you're talking about private prisons.
Address for a moment the dynamic where you have private enterprise saying, look, you can't have prisoners doing meaningful work. I mean, because you talk about a couple of programs that involve prisoners actually sort of producing goods that are outside of sort of them being consumed within the context of the prison itself. So in other words, not a dishwasher, but maybe they're making, I think, I can't remember specifically what you cited, but there was one where they're making, I don't know, was it motorcycles or something?
Yeah, they make tons of stuff. Inmates make, the things that people make in prison you would not believe. There's two different mechanisms by which they can do this. There's a program called Correctional Industries, which is each state has its own correctional industries program where they set up shops that are meant to sort of mimic real-life workshops and workplaces and factories. And the inmates produce goods and services for sale only to state institutions. So it varies from state to state, but usually it's either like city governments, state governments, county governments. Some states allow them to sell them to nonprofit organizations. But the idea is that you sort of limit their customer base as a way of minimizing the impact of competition with their products and free world competitors. So a really common thing that inmates make is furniture. They'll make like desks, desk chairs, and a lot of state offices will use furniture that's made by inmates in these workshops. And, the argument is that this is teaching them real-world skills. It's teaching them job ethics, like what it feels like to wake up and go to a job every day. One of the shop managers I talked to said, a lot of these guys, the only job they ever had in their life is street pharmaceuticals, which was, his joke way of saying that they were drug dealers or drug users, which is frankly probably true. And so sort of teaching them a work ethic, like having to answer to a boss and having to come to work at a certain time every day and learning to sort of be told what to do. And also on the flip side, learning to sort of use your critical thinking skills about how to address various problems and all of that stuff. However, furniture makers on the outside and representatives from states that do that kind of manufacturing, like Michigan, have always hated these kind of programs, right? It's because they say, well, we can't compete with a program where you're paying people 25 cents an hour. That's just not fair. That's unfair competition. And the more extreme version of these correctional industries programs, this is actually federal law. It's called the PI program, Prison Industrial Enhancement. And I just want to say at the outset that there's only 4,000 prisoners who do this work out of 2.2 million in this country. So it's a tiny, tiny program, but it really gets people up in arms because it takes the correctional industries model to an extreme, which is it allows private companies to come into prisons and set up factories in the prisons and use the inmates as workers in the factories. And they are, by statute, required to pay, quote-unquote, prevailing wage for their industry, so they don't get the wage savings, at least not theoretically, but they don't have to pay rent on the facility, they don't have to pay vacation time, they don't have to pay overtime or, any of those things that we talked about earlier. And so free world competitors say, this is totally unfair. They're undercutting our business. They're undercutting our prices, and And so that's what makes that program incredibly controversial, one of many things.
How would you, address that? I mean, it seems to me that, why should we give this company that's selling on the private market? Obviously, if you pay sort of a competitive wage, then that deals with at least the labor question. I'm not so sure that we should be allowing a private entity to come in and get rent-free facilities. But how do you deal with that issue of it?
It's a really thorny question. I have a lot of ambivalence about the PI program. I think there's a lot of people who want it to be eliminated entirely. I did, in the course of my reporting, see some good that came of people doing this kind of work, and especially the wages. They're the highest wages in prison because they're required to pay prevailing wage. I should say 80% of it is garnished for room and board and other things like victims' compensation. But still, even 20% of, say, like a $9 an hour salary or a $12 an hour salary is hugely different.
Right,
a lot
5 or
more
6
money.
times more the median pay.
Exactly. So, people really want to do this work, and I think there's value in it. So I'm not prepared to write it off completely, but I think the way that it's structured right now is very problematic. Like, for instance, the audits for these PI workshops are done by the National Correctional Industries Association, which is the association of companies that run these workshops. So you've got, as one of my sources said, the correctional industries fox guarding the hen house.
Right.
So that's one problem. Another problem is that the way that they determine what prevailing wage is in that industry is very shaky. It often ends up being minimum wage. So then you really are undercutting wages. I mean, I am sensitive to the argument that when you're running a workshop in a prison, you lose a lot of productivity for things like counts and lockdowns. You got materials that have to be searched before they can go in and out. So, I do understand, it's not that straightforward that they can run exactly the same workshop and pay less. They do lose some productivity by operating in a prison. How you address that, man, I don't know. That's above my pay grade.
All right. Well, and lastly, so it's unlikely. I don't know if it's unlikely, but it seems like it's a steep hill to climb to see this resolved through our political process. Although, like we started this conversation out, there is movement on the conservative side, and so maybe you see some type of sort of trans ideological partnership here that provides some type of prison reform here. But what are the chances of this being fixed in the context of the courts? I mean, if slave labor is essentially legal in the context of prisons, and it doesn't constitute cruel and unusual punishment, I guess. Is there any chance in the context of the courts for some change?
Well, the short answer is no. There was a lawsuit as recently as 2010 where they said, basically no. So I don't really see the courts providing any sort of change in this regard. Sadly, I had one legal scholar point out to me that, the 13th Amendment says that slavery is prohibited except as punishment for a crime, and that most of these jobs are not punishment. In fact, a lot of these jobs are a privilege. People wait on waiting lists, and they have to have a certain amount of good time before they can get these jobs. So, potentially someone could one day make the argument that, these jobs are not used as punishment. In fact, and so the 13th Amendment doesn't apply here. I don't know what kind of traction they'd get given, what judges have said over the last, 20, 30 years. My guess is not much. I actually have more hope for sort of work release programs going forward. Prisons are looking for ways to reduce their populations on the back end. So, like, people are revisiting the idea of parole. And I think work release programs would be a great way to start, a good place to start, because you're talking about people who are going to get out soonish anyway, and setting up sort of furlough systems or places or ways that people can get out and start working year, 2 years years, 3 years before their sentence is set to expire would be a great place to start, and one that I think would be a little bit more politically feasible.
Beth Schwartzapfel, the piece is The Great American Chain Gang. It is in this month's, I believe, May, June, American Prospect. We'll put a link to it, obviously, at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.